Welcome to Confronting Injustice. What if justice wasn't just blind, but broken? What if the very system designed to protect the innocent is the very same system responsible for condemning them? Across this country, there are many men and women still sitting in prison serving a life sentence for crimes they did not commit. Not because of doubt, not because of technicalities, but because of the truth. The truth was never fully seen, heard, or believed. Welcome to Confronting Injustice, where we do not tell the comfortable version of the story, we tell the truth. I am your host, Linda Solomon. Before we begin tonight's powerful conversation, we want to share an important update with our viewers. Our Marcus Garvey series will resume in June, and in the interim, we are honored to bring you a special 5-part series that delves into the urgent and often overlooked issues of wrongful convictions. Today's show is the first in that series, entitled Confronting Injustice, Turning Lived Experiences into Knowledge, Strength, and Power. This is more than a discussion. It is a call to awareness, a call to accountability, and ultimately a call to action. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by a friend, a person who has unquestionably committed his adult life to uncovering the truth, advocating for the unheard, and challenging a system that too often refuses to correct itself. Robert is, among other things, a paralegal professional and the founder of 2 nonprofit organizations. Robert, before we get started, would you like to tell us a little bit about the 2 organizations? Actually, why don't you tell us a bit about urban restorative justice, very briefly, because our focus is the actual innocent projects.
Okay. Hi, good evening. Thank you,
Good
Linda, for
evening.
inviting me to this segment of Confronting Injustice. My name is Robert Aldrich. I grew up in the Boston area. As a youth, I grew up during the turbulent racial times of the late 70s into the 80s. I got into a lot of mischief, got myself in trouble, and ended up in prison several times. And what I started to see during my time in prison was that many young men who were misguided, misdirected, continuously returned back to prison or was re-guided back into prison through the system. The system did not have a fair and honest approach to rehabilitation, especially to young men of color. Like I said, it was a highly racial, turbulent times. So we weren't considered as valuable, nor considered as assets to the community. So after returning to the prison system several times, I realized that there was something wrong, not just with my error in judgment and making mistakes in my judgment, but the system itself. The system helped to perpetuate that, and so many others that were incarcerated at the time or during this time. The system perpetuates misbehavior and perpetuates the factors that lead into recidivism. So while I was in prison, I educated myself, went to college, I went through a lot of programs. I did a lot of therapy classes for my own personal inner growth and self-improvement. And I started recognizing that there were some commonalities amongst us. And a lot of it was cognitive and behavioral, like we kept doing the same thing and expect different results. So I began to lead many different types of programs in many different prisons, mind you. And as a result of that, I began to develop programs that I thought were very important to our survival and to put this recidivism to rest, so to speak.
So that was your motivation to kind of
That was my motivation. But for Urban Restorative Justice Group. To be quite frank, the reason why I says Urban Restorative Justice Group, because more than 85% of the men that were incarcerated came from urban communities, whether it was Boston, Springfield, Worcester, Fall River. The majority of the people that were in prison came from urban cities. And the minority, very, very few, came from suburban communities. And the programs that were being utilized by the Department of Corrections were not necessarily geared to deal with the culture of urbanites, especially black and brown men. So because of that, there was a disconnect between the programs and the people for whom the programs were supposedly to be applied with. I sat in classes, 6 weeks worth of classes at a time, and didn't get virtually anything out of it because of the models that they used didn't even apply to me or to people from urban communities or people from, quote unquote, the black community or the brown community. We just could not equate with some of the Eurocentric models that they used. And those models came probably out of the 40s and the 50s, by peniologists, so to speak, way back, 40, 50 years prior. And they were still using those particular models. So you
developed programs.
Correct. This is where I started developing concepts to programs. I didn't develop the program yet. It was concepts, and I started talking with other people similarly situated as myself, and older men who've been in and out of prison since the 70s. And like I said, these patterns I started to recognize, and then I started studying this concept called criminogenics. And criminogenics dealt with behavior, attitudes, associations, things of that nature. And I realized that seemed to be more of a commonality amongst us than anything else. And that's when I developed a program called Urban Restorative Justice Group. Restorative justice in its early stages dealt with the victims of crimes and the victims and their families, which I respect that. But what happened to the perpetrators of these crimes, the men and the women that are coming back to the community? If there's no place for them to fit in, then like water will seek its own level, they'll find a way to survive. And if they can't be accepted back into the community and be recognized as an asset, then they're going to return back to the community as a liability. So that's where urban restorative justice was formulated at.
Okay. Well, interesting. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that information. And at some point, we'll have a deeper conversation about that, because I know, although it was developed in prison, you're actively doing work in the community now.
Correct.
But with our focus being actual innocence, can you tell the audience or the listeners or viewers what that term actually means? Like and what is actual innocent, the Actual Innocent Project? And what does that mean? Where did it come from? Okay.
The Actual Innocence Project, AIP, was coined by myself how should I say? I don't want to say in contrast, but in collaboration with the Innocent Project. When the Innocent Project came out back in, I believe in the 90s, when it had to do with DNA, and they started finding finding a lot of men that were innocent, that did not commit mostly rapes and things of that. The Innocent Project were overturning convictions, and this was unheard of. If it wasn't for DNA, these men would have probably spent the rest of their lives in prison for crimes they did not commit. And I became what you might call a legal beagle, jailhouse lawyer, if you will. I studied the law from the 80s, early 80s, until actually the present now. And I started realizing that there were men that were in prison that were actually innocent. Not just men that were found to be innocent, but men that were actually innocent. There was another category of men that society and the Department of Corrections and the justice system does not want the public to know about. And that's the scary part.
Why wouldn't they want people to know if someone is actually innocent?
Right.
And, I think most people would say, if you're in jail, you must be guilty. I think that's like a more common thought than not.
Correct.
And so what you're saying is there are people who are sitting in prison for life, some whom sitting in life for life, who are actually innocent. And what is
so the difference is actual innocence, the word is actual, the Actual Innocence Project, AIP. Actual means that the government, let's just say the Commonwealth, the District Attorney's Office, whether it was Springfield, Hampden County, Norfolk County, Suffolk County, Essex County, they know that the person who they convicted and imposed a life sentence upon did not commit the homicide. Let's just use that as an example. There are a lot of men who are serving life sentences who did not commit the homicide. And the person who committed the homicide usually pleads out early and receives a second-degree life sentence, where the person who may have been there, who had no involvement, who's declaring their innocence, they fight their case and end up getting a first-degree life sentence without the possibility of parole. Now, that's a flip injustice. That's a topsy-turvy flip side to the epitome of injustice. The person who commits the homicide, who takes the life, pleads out and gets a deal in which that person gets a second-degree life sentence and is eligible for parole in 15 years and is probably released, when 2 or 3 other people who may have been there or may have had some kind of limited involvement in the situation fight the case, go to trial, and get a first-degree life sentence, a natural life sentence, till the day they die.
So Rob, how is it possible that someone who actually committed a crime, took someone's life, can get second degree and be out when bystanders are serving life? How is that? How does that work? That doesn't seem. Just seems insane.
Well, it's not insane. It's called injustice. Period. Let's just call it like it is. It's injustice. There's a lot of young men that went to prison in the late 80s and early 90s, when you got to remember the time that the law started changing to be more harsh. Joint venture laws have been in existence for centuries in the United States that comes from England. So joint venture is what law enforcement used to gather up a whole bunch of people. One person commit the crime, and then they'll arrest 5 other people along with them in order to actually manipulate the system, where out of the 5, maybe 1 or 2 will turn state's evidence against the one who committed the crime. So it's really a diabolical process by law enforcement and the prosecution to use the superior resources of the state to get a conviction, and by any means necessary. So it happens a lot. For instance, a woman is involved with a guy or another guy who knows somebody, and because she doesn't want to testify, they threaten to take her children away from her. That's coercion. That's coercion. She doesn't want her children to be taken, so she'll say whatever they want them to say. And there's been many cases in which she would even provide false testimony to save her children from being taken away from her. So this is kind of like how joint venture works. So, and I'm not saying that there isn't times where a group of guys go out to commit a robbery and a person gets murdered during the process. That happens. Unfortunately, that happens.
Right.
And then that's the typical explanation of joint venture. But there's all kinds of other misuses of joint venture. Like I said, when you go back to the crime bill in the early 90s, when President Clinton signed the crime bill that was written by then Vice President Biden, who wrote the crime bill, when you had the 100-to-1 ratio for cocaine, if you remember that, where, 1 gram of cocaine, crack cocaine found on black or brown youth in the city would be the functional, he would be subjected to the functional equivalent of 100 grams of cocaine found by a white youth in the suburbs. The punishment would be almost equal, which is obviously it can't be, but it was. And so when President Clinton decided to sign the crime bill, it was to offer the states federal money. And that federal money was to underfund the prison systems across the country. The prison systems were going broke. It was almost $1 billion a year in California. So in order to underfund the prison systems, President Clinton signed that crime bill in which federal funds flowed into the state prison system to underfund the state prison system, and to keep the state prison systems functioning or flowing, they needed bodies. If they had less prisoners, they would get less money. If they had more prisoners, they would get more money. Okay. So it does break down to economics. This was the school to prison pipeline. Sure. The school to prison pipeline that people talk about in mass incarceration.
Right. Let me ask you a question. So I would imagine that, and I'm thinking about joint venture now.
Right.
So someone pleads out, and the 1 or 2 other individuals say, "Well, I'm not responsible. I didn't know what he was going to do."
Right.
So they go to court,
right,
thinking the system is just and that
right.
they'll get a fair shake.
Right.
And so you're saying that there were many people in jail who took that position. I didn't
That's
kill
right.
anyone. I didn't intend to. I didn't know it was going to happen.
Right. Yeah, and this is what, throughout my years of incarceration, I started finding, I didn't believe it either. I didn't believe that this was something that was going on. I was just like the public. I only knew a little bit. The Iron Curtain of the Department of Corrections don't let you view what's going on inside. They don't give you information. They don't give you statistical information, certain statistical information based on race, economics, certain crimes. It's very, very general. Excuse me, very, very general. And what I started finding probably in the last 10 years of my years of incarceration was that there were men who actually did not commit the homicide, but were serving first-degree life sentences. And when I first heard that, I was completely baffled. I was like, no way, that's impossible. You're not telling the truth. But as I started reading their cases and started looking at the paperwork, and I started realizing you are innocent. You didn't do anything. You was just the wrong place at the wrong time, and you have a life sentence, and you've been in 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years, and the person who actually possibly committed the homicide, they're already out. They pled guilty, took a second-degree life sentence, went to the parole board, got out, and is walking around living their life on the streets while you're still sitting in prison. And that's when I decided to create a different type of innocent program the actual innocent program. Because the Commonwealth knows this person is innocent because they prosecuted the person who actually committed the homicide. And I could probably name more than a dozen cases, which I won't do for protection of privacy of these individuals. But these people are still in prison today.
Well, how are you? I'm wondering if we should name some cases, because what's the possibility of them getting out if they don't get help from the public? I mean, what is their recourse, especially if they're poor?
Well, well said. There's legislation that's pending to start to look at these joint venture cases. And I'm not saying that the legislation is the most ideal legislation, but there's a lot of legislation that's being put together by senators and representatives like Russell Holmes and Miranda, Liz Miranda, and others. You know, even Aldrich. I mean, I kind of developed a respect for Aldrich, even though his name was close to mine. But I developed a respect for him because he's been looking at these situations, these dynamics of the prison system as well, and they see where these problems come in at. Now, let me get back to actual innocence, because when society takes a look, and when I say society, I mean the community, the public, takes a look at statistics. For instance, if you looked at MCI Norfolk, and it says there's 362 lifers at MCI Norfolk.
362.
That's a lot. It's a big number, but there's a lot of lifers there. You know, there's a presumption that 362 people committed murder. But when you look behind those statistics, that's absolutely not true. More than half of them did not commit a homicide.
You think the number's that high?
The number's high, very, very high. Because when the joint venture started being used and abused by the system, it was in conjunction with the crime bill that then President Clinton signed in the early 90s. And if you remember, this is when gang violence started to rise started to transfer from the West Coast to the East Coast. So when the gang violence and copycat gangs began over here in New England and, you know, in Buffalo, in Baltimore and New Jersey and all that, the problem was that their response, the law enforcement's response, was to grab up all these young people at one time. One person commit the crime, and they'll grab 5 others, and they'll charge them all. Now, there's a lot of historical cases, which I just won't go into at this time because people are still litigating their cases. But in Boston alone, you know, there's probably at least 5 to 10 cases in which these young people back in the 90s were arrested en masse, and they were prosecuted under the theory of joint venture. And then there were people who was in those groups that was forced into providing state's evidence against the other people to make a deal to get out so that they wouldn't get a life sentence. And so it's kind of diabolical, you know, it really is.
I would say more than diabolical, because I would imagine a lot of these people who got caught up in joint venture were young people.
Yes.
1.
Yeah.
And 2, what was the system for young people who were not of color? Were they subjected to the joint venture, or did the district attorney or have other options for them?
Perfect questions. The selective prosecution. And selective prosecution means that the district attorney's office in whatever county chooses to prosecute who they want to prosecute. For instance, there may be, say if there was 6 young people and drinking in a public, in a graveyard somewhere, and drinking and partying or whatever, and all of a sudden one guy pulls out a gun and starts shooting at people, and yet they charge, instead of them charging all 6 of them because they was there, you know, that's quote unquote, you know, some basic joint venture stuff. They would say, no, you know, we're just going to charge the one person who committed the homicide. But when it came to black and brown communities, they immediately, this was their response to what they believed was gang-related activities. Now, there are cases in which people 2 or 3 guys might have been in a car together, and one guy goes into the store and robs the store and possibly even shoots the store clerk and kills him and comes back out and get into the car, and the other 2 people in the car don't even know anything about it. Now, there's a famous case in Massachusetts about that called the Odell case. And Odell did not know what his partner was doing when he went into rob, what the guy he was with went into rob the store. He had no idea. But the Commonwealth kept that away from the grand jury. So the grand jury didn't even know that misinformation.
He was an innocent bystander.
He was an innocent bystander, right. So there's a lot of, so my whole point of the actual Innocent Project is that there is a segment of men and women in the prison system.
A significant
segment now that their cases need to be re-looked at, re-examined, and they should not be serving the highest punishment that you could receive short of the death penalty, life imprisonment without parole. Their sentences, their punishment should be definitely reduced, if anything, or vacated, because it's just that's complete injustice.
It's insane.
Right.
That's really, really unfortunate. And I've never been in prison, so I don't know what it's like. But from my research, it is prison is a toxic environment.
Yeah.
And so to be in prison for something you did not do,
right.
I don't know what that does to someone's mental state of being. I can't even imagine.
Well, it's a definite negative impact. I mean,
being in prison is negative, but being innocent and put in that environment.
Right. It's malignant. It really, you would almost never be the same after that, because being in prison alone separates you from your family, separates you from your children, your wife. You lose your assets, your property. You lose job opportunities. Right. You lose so much. You don't get to pay into the Social Security system because you don't have enough points to, right. because you spent maybe a decade or 2 or 3 decades in the system. And there's no retirement plan from the system except to return to the system and live out the remainder of your life right. inside the system, the institution. We become institutionalized, So there is some really, really heavy collateral consequences to spending decades in prison for crimes that you didn't even commit. Now let's not just make this about homicide. There are people who are in prison who are wrongfully convicted for other types of crimes
Absolutely.
too. Absolutely. Whether it's drug offenses, whether it's burglaries mm-hmm. or some kind of robbery. I mean, it's like 3 or 4 people get arrested in a drug house, and 3 of them are drug addicts, and 1 of them is the drug dealer, but everyone gets convicted for what they found in the house, and they're all sentenced to prison, but yet 3 of them may be drug addicts. So there needs to be a better way to approach prosecution of crimes.
Absolutely. And, I want to mention, you just mentioned this, but I think it's worthy of saying it again. When people are incarcerated, their family is impacted in such a way that can be irreparable. And so for people who know that their loved one is innocent and they're in jail, the damage is, how do you repair that damage if they ever get out? I mean, I think the level of inhumanity is so extreme, it's beyond my comprehension, really, because you think about your brother or your father or your daughter or your sister being in jail, imprisoned, for something he didn't or she didn't do.
Right. That's a good question, because I don't think I've ever read anything, and I've read quite extensively. I don't think I've ever read anything comprehensive about the psychological effects on family members when someone is sent to prison, male or female. Females is probably 5 times worse because they have
especially
children.
If they have children.
Yeah, especially
mm-hmm.
if they have children involved. But there's probably not a lot of studies on it because they don't want to identify like you said, the inhumanity of it, and they don't want, the powers that be don't want to identify the fact that there's some cruelty involved here. You know, of course, the Eighth Amendment talks about cruelty. Well, that's cruelty, you
Absolutely.
know, to depose, remove, let's just say a father from his family, and the next time he sees his son or daughter, you know, they're adults.
As
You know,
is the case with James Watson,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. There's there's almost literally no repairing that. You can work on where you're at, but you can't repair the decades of damage, the decades of separation.
Yeah.
You know, there was an old saying, I did read this somewhere a long, long time ago. I think Justice Blackstone said this, so that was 1400s, 1500s. He said that when a person is sent to prison, he's sentenced to civil death. Civil death. Death. And the reason why they're saying it was civil death is because back then, when you were sent to prison, the king took all your property, took everything you owned, and the wife didn't own anything anyway. The man owned everything, not the wife or the children. The man owned everything. So the king would take all of his property if he was sent to prison for any reason, and it would be absorbed into the kingdom. So civil death still exists today because when you go into the prisons, when a man or a woman is sent to prison, not only do they lose all of these things and the separation with the families, but it impacts them even after their incarceration because they also implemented laws, they also implemented laws like the Scarlet Letter so that you can't get certain jobs. You can't work in hospitals. You can't work with children. You can't work in nursing homes. You can't work in pharmaceutical or places where they serve medications at. And, you know, there's just a whole list of places where you can't work at because you were deemed to be a felon or an ex-felon. And I'm not saying that it's right. I'm not saying that it's entirely wrong, but there's some, you know, it excludes people from government jobs. You can't be a police officer, a fireman. Right. You can't be an EMT. There's a lot of jobs that the job market that you're excluded from. So when you look at the job market, if you use the job market as a 100% model, and then you add these restrictions because of ex-felons, it reduces it down to less than 40% of the kind of jobs you could get. And that within that 40%, most of it is labor, unskilled.
Yeah.
You know, you're fighting for these kind of jobs with a lot of people who've come to the country who are immigrants, and they come here and they fight for those jobs as well. So now it gets to be more of more contention fighting for those jobs, those low-paying, low-wages jobs with people who are coming out of prison, who are trying to get back into mainstream society with people who are already out here vying for those very same jobs.
That's interesting because I often say the system is complicit, and this is an example of the system being complicit. Not exclusively for people who've been exonerated or but if there's little opportunity when you get out, and you shouldn't have been there anyway, then what is compounded damage?
Right.
It
leads to recidivism. Call it like it is. People feel like this: if I can't get it the right way, I'll get it by hook or by crook. Right. And let me say this, and I think people don't even think about this. If this was a real legitimate business, it would have been bankrupt a long time ago. It would have been bankrupt.
You said if this was a legitimate business, what is this?
In other words, say if this was a IBM or, a big corporation and they couldn't show results, that, profitable results, you'd be out of business.
Right.
But this is a business where they don't show profitable results. They make and spend more money when society fails, when there's they blame society's failures. They profit off of society's failures. If the people in the communities didn't fail, if the young people didn't get arrested, if people didn't go to prison, then there'd be less prisons and less money. So they couldn't make, there's no profitability there. But there's no way that there should be a profitability with the Department of Corrections, the Parole Board, the Probation Department.
Right.
We should not be expending almost $1 billion a year just to keep these institutions functioning, which is based on unions and all these other people who have a vested interest in keeping these entities going.
Thriving.
Yes, thriving, exactly.
And not only keeps them thriving, but keeps them thriving because what I've noticed is now there are a lot of older, senior people being released to make space for these younger people.
Right. Well, they
that's not by chance.
No, that's by design. More than 20 years ago, I remember there were some articles that was written about, prisoners, becoming gray-haired prisoners. I think that's what the article was entitled, something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And what they were saying that it costs more to keep an older prisoner in prison than it would be to let that person out of prison, and they're no longer they're aged out. They're no longer a threat to the community, but they knew this before. But it may cost $250,000 to provide medical care for that same person in prison,
right.
And probably not even a fifth of that for if you release them back into society. So their decision to release prisoners was economic. It was
another economic.
Yeah, it was right. The two differences is retributive justice, which is punishment, and restorative justice, which is to restore that person. Retributive justice is how this system functions. Retribution. Punish, punish, punish.
Right.
That's the difference.
That's the system.
And if this was a restorative justice system, then it would function on a different model. Absolutely. It would function on placing more emphasis and more funding into rehabilitation and preparing people for coming back into society, being law-abiding and productive citizens. But that's not the case. That's not productive for the guards unions, the prison union, the probation and parole. Right. If that was to succeed, then we wouldn't need to spend so much money on that end of the spectrum.
It really sounds like it's a skewed system, especially in the United States, with so many people being incarcerated. There are more people incarcerated in the United States than anywhere else in the world.
True.
But I want the listeners to recognize that this show is an invitation for people to rethink their narrative.
Right.
Because many people think, if someone's in jail, they must be guilty. Right. One, not necessarily true. Also, they might think, well, if the system got it wrong, they would be motivated to get it right.
Right.
Which is not the case. When Rachel Rawlins started that integrity unit,
correct, right.
And that simply was just to look at cases that were questionable.
Right.
She got a lot of flack for that. People didn't want to open those cases.
No.
They didn't want to open those cases at all. And then we were talking about Mulligan, that police officer who was murdered.
Yep, John Mulligan.
He reigned at a period of time when there were a lot of dirty cops.
Right.
We know that, the history, people know that.
Right.
What happened to all those people that they're responsible for putting in jail? That they set up, that they, what? We know that there was a regime, right, and that they were responsible for a lot of dastardly deeds.
Right.
Many people are in jail because of what they did. How come nobody wants to look at those cases? So let me say. So this show was an invitation for people to rethink, to hear primary source information. Right? This is not hearsay, second, and to think about what you believe to be true.
True. Right. And just to piggyback off what you just said, all we got to do is go back to the Carol Stewart murder and look at Detective Peter O'Malley, who put out the word into the black community with Kevin White, saying that it was a black man that shot and murdered a pregnant white woman, and they wreaked havoc into the black communities, not just in Massachusetts, but all up and down the East Coast, looking for this so-called black man that did not do it, clearly did not do it, and there was no apology to the community about what happened. And so many people went to jail back then.
Yeah.
So many people went to prison. And we even had
But
black
brutalized
ministers.
before they got to prison.
Yeah. Huh?
Brutalized before they got to prison.
Yeah, definitely. And we even had black ministers in our community that said, root that devil out our community. Got on TV. I mean, I never forget this. I mean, got on TV, ministers. They created the 10-point coalition committee and so many others that, that benefited off of this, and they never came back to apologize to the black community or the black men that suffered at the hands of this historic racism from the police department going all the way back into the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klans, most of them were police officers.
Yeah.
Let's get it real here.
Well, let me ask you a question, Rob. We know that modern day slavery is we know that modern day policing is rooted in slavery policing.
That's right.
And so at what point, you're a historian, among other things,
Okay.
At what point in our United States history was there a review of the transition from slave catchers to modern day policing? At what point in our history was there an evaluation or an assessment or something to say, this is not what we want to do, this is not, and then they did something differently? When did that happen?
Well, historically, the slave catchers, the bounty hunters, if you will, they call them bounty hunters, they call them slave catchers. They still had some kind of authority to do what they were doing. And that means that, the sheriffs of the towns or the governors of the particular states or I don't think there was really mayors back then, they would deputize these yahoos, these white so-called slave catchers to go out and look for runaway slaves. They put all kinds of bounties on them. There was all kinds of beatings, tortures, and what have you. And then that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough because everyone wasn't a slave. So the black men or families that were thriving, these Ku Klux Klans back then decided, hold it, we don't want you to have all of this. You don't get to have 10 acres of land and start to be productive and, be in competition with, white, landowners and what have you. And this is how they use the law system, the quote unquote law enforcement system to go after these people. These weren't just ordinary white people. These were ordinary white people with badges behind them.
Right.
Of course, they would hide the badge, but you knew who was under the hood. And so even to this day, I mean, just follow it all the way up to what's happening now. We could probably pinpoint 100 different instances where the white police attack black men and women and children. I mean, that's historic. I mean, that really is.
Absolutely.
If a person doesn't get that, then they're not even on this planet. Well, they gotta take a look at why black people have this very, very disjunctive relationship with law enforcement and police. Yes, times have changed. Yes, we're getting black people into the police departments and what have you. We're getting diversity, if you will, and hopefully that will somewhat make a difference. But it's still happening. It's
So
still
there was
going
no
on.
one point when people assessed the system as a corrupt.
It's been ongoing. It's like this, you can't just say, oh, it just started on this date. It's been going before slavery, during slavery, after slavery, till the present.
Well, then it makes sense what's happening, people being shot in the street, and it makes sense. If there was never a review or an assessment or a clear, distinct decision that this is not what we want to be, this is not what we want to be, then it makes sense what's happening now.
Of course.
So my point was, at any point in our history, did the criminal justice system reflect and say, okay, this is what we were, this is what we want to be? Like,
Yeah.
was it? To your knowledge, was there ever?
No, I think that that's saying the fox in the hen house. Like, how can you ask the person who create this system, who benefits from this system, to examine the system and make a determination that the system is racially motivated, racial discrimination, when they are part of the system, when they benefit from the system, they're not going to do that. You can't expect that. That would be
just asking because I thought maybe something it happened and I didn't study that in history or something.
Yeah, it's up to us. People who are of clear mind can identify these different segments of society, and I'm not saying that we totally don't need our communities policed. Yes, we do. We need police protection. We don't need police corruption and violence. But yes, we should have a law-abiding society, not a lawless society. And lawlessness can come from the police as well. Absolutely. And that's what should not be happening. There's so much to what we're talking about today that it's hard to just peel the skins back on this onion and get down to the nitty-gritty. But getting back to actual innocence, which is what I was invited here to speak about, I think it's important just to know, to let our viewers know that there are different segments of the prison system where people have not even committed the crime that they're in prison for, wrongfully convicted, if you will. And it doesn't have to be just homicide. It could be robbery. It could be anything. It could be drugs, wrong place, wrong time. It could be a whole bunch of things. So it just got people thinking. What people do, they just don't want to think about it at all. Just send them to prison and I won't have to worry about it at all until it's their child or their niece or their nephew or their uncle or their father. Then it becomes, a paramount issue. Right.
But you know what, I want to thank you for being here, and I know we have some guests coming back. Our focus is wrongful convictions, and so we'll have you come back with some other people just to share these stories. And we want people to be thinking about, what can I do? What can I do? What's happening is not right. And so this conversation doesn't end here, because justice is not just a concept, right? True. It is a responsibility. And when one innocent person remains in jail, or when one innocent person is incarcerated, we all have work to do.
True.
We do. And so thank you for joining us on Confronting Injustice. Stay with us as we continue to turn truth into knowledge, and knowledge into strength, and strength into power.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.